The year is 2020. You are walking through a city that was engineered for 1 million people. The scale is overwhelming. Boulevards wide enough for parades. Towers of glass and steel reaching into the haze. European-style plazas. Replicas of Parisian architecture. Manicured parks designed to rival Central Park. Subway stations that look like something pulled straight from a sci-fi movie. This place was not built cheaply. It was built to impress. And yet, something is wrong. There are no footsteps echoing on the sidewalks. No children in the parks. No cars waiting at intersections. Traffic lights obediently cycle from red to green for vehicles that will never arrive. Elevators hum, rise, descend, serving floors that have never known a single resident. Wind howls through empty corridors, whistling between concrete pillars like a warning no one is listening to. The only sound in this metropolis is absence. This isn't a scene from The Last of Us. This isn't a post-apocalyptic simulation. There was no war here, no plague, no evacuation order. This is modern-day China. What you are looking at is not a failure of architecture. It is a failure of math. A contradiction so large it should not exist, yet does. China today has an estimated 65 million empty homes. Enough vacant housing to shelter the entire population of France. Entire cities built, financed, sold, and recorded as economic success without the people required to justify their existence. At its peak, China's property sector was valued at roughly $60 trillion, making it the largest asset class in human history. Larger than the U.S. stock market. Larger than all the gold ever mined. Larger than the economies of most continents. And now, it is collapsing slowly, unevenly, and dangerously. This is not just a story about bad investments or falling prices. It's about the human cost of believing growth can be engineered forever. It's about corruption disguised as development. And it's about the most ambitious economic illusion the modern world has ever seen. Because what happened here wasn't an accident. It was a system. And like all systems built on denial, it worked beautifully right up until the moment it didn't. To understand how a nation ended up with cities no one lives in, we need to start with a statistic that sounds vacant till you verify it. Between 2011 and 2013, China used more cement than the United States used during the entire 20th century. Let that sink in. In just 3 years, China poured more concrete than America used to build the Hoover Dam, the interstate highway system, the Empire State Building, every post-war suburb, and every major city expansion combined. This wasn't incremental growth. This was industrial-scale obsession. And it raises an obvious question. Was there a sudden, desperate need to house hundreds of millions of people? No. What China was building wasn't shelter. It was GDP. To understand why, we have to rewind to 1994 to a policy decision that quietly rewired the incentives of an entire nation. That year, Beijing restructured China's tax system. The central government claimed the majority of tax revenue for itself, leaving local governments responsible for funding schools, hospitals, roads, subways, and social services with almost no stable income to pay for them. Imagine you're a mayor in a provincial city. You're still judged on one thing above all else: economic growth, but you're broke. No tax base, no fiscal autonomy. No way to meet Beijing's expectations. Except, you own the land. In China, all land is state-owned. And suddenly, local governments realized something profound. If you can't tax productivity, you can sell geography. So they seized farmland from rural families, often paying pennies on the dollar, and sold long-term land use rights to property developers for massive sums. These payments were called land transfer fees, and they became the financial lifeline of local governments across the country. Overnight, mayors went from bankrupt to flush with cash. Subways appeared. Stadiums rose. New districts materialized out of nothing. But there was a catch. To keep the money flowing, land prices had to keep rising. If land prices fell, the entire local government balance sheet collapsed. So officials did what any system addicted to growth does. They pushed developers to build everywhere. Whether people were moving in didn't matter. Whether jobs existed didn't matter. What mattered was that construction itself created economic activity. Here's the dark joke at the heart of it all. If you dig a hole and fill it back in, you've created nothing of value. But if you paid someone to dig it, bought equipment, moved materials, and filed paperwork, GDP goes up. China began building cities the same way, not to be lived in, but to be counted. Entire urban zones like Ordos in Inner Mongolia were hailed as the future, the Dubai of northern China. Billions were poured into luxury apartments, museums, and cultural centers. By the time journalists arrived years later, they found silence. Street sweepers cleaning roads for residents who never came. Shopping malls with escalators running to nowhere. Apartments sold as investments, not homes. This wasn't housing demand. It was a feedback loop. And to supercharge it, China created something even more dangerous. Local government financing vehicles, GFVs. These were shadow entities set up by local governments to borrow money from banks often state-owned to fund infrastructure and development. Today, they hold an estimated $9 trillion in hidden debt. That's roughly the GDP of Germany and Japan combined, existing off the books, partially unaccounted for, and politically untouchable. Local governments sold land to entities they controlled. Those entities borrowed from banks the state controlled. The money built apartments no one needed, which inflated land prices, which justified more borrowing. It was a closed circuit, a snake eating its own tail, except the snake was made of concrete and the tail was the life savings of the Chinese middle class, and at the time, it looked like a miracle. If the first act of this story was about concrete and incentives, this is the part where it becomes personal. Because bubbles don't just collapse on balance sheets, they collapse inside kitchens, family meetings, and whispered conversations between parents and children. To understand the real damage of China's housing crash, you have to understand who paid for it. In the West, buying a new home follows a simple logic. You put down a deposit, construction finishes, you get the keys. Then and only then you start paying the full mortgage. You don't pay for the pizza until the pizza arrives. China flipped that logic on its head. The standard practice became the pre-sale model. Here's how it worked. Imagine you are Mr. Lee. You're a factory supervisor in Henan province. You've worked 60-hour weeks for 20 years. You don't speculate, don't gamble, you save. Your son is reaching marriage age. And in China, there is an unspoken rule more powerful than law. No apartment, no marriage. A property deed is not just an asset, it's a social prerequisite. So Mr. Lee does what millions of fathers did. He drains his savings. His parents contribute. His in-laws help. Together, they walk into a glossy sales office owned by one of China's most prestigious developers. The model apartment gleams under bright lights. There's a gym, a playground, green space. Completion date, 2023. They ask for full payment up front, a mortgage that begins immediately. The apartment doesn't exist yet. It's a hole in the ground. Mr. Lee signs. So did tens of millions of others. By the late 2010s, nearly 90% of homes sold in China were sold before completion. And this is where the system quietly crossed a line. Because the money Mr. Lee paid was not used to build Mr. Lee's home. Instead, developers used it to buy more land from local governments who desperately needed cash. That land was then used as collateral to borrow more money from banks. That money funded marketing for new projects sold to new buyers. New money paid old debts. Old promises funded new promises. This wasn't development. It was a Ponzi structure disguised as urbanization. And for years, it worked. Why? Because prices only went up. Mr. Lee didn't panic when construction slowed. On paper, his unfinished apartment had already earned 20% in value. He felt richer even though nothing had been built. That illusion powered the machine. Until August 2020. That's when Beijing finally admitted quietly that the bomb had grown too large. The government introduced the 3 red lines policy, restricting how much debt developers could carry. If companies crossed those limits, borrowing stopped. Overnight, the music cut out. Developers like Evergrande, burdened with hundreds of billions in liabilities, could no longer refinance. Contractors stopped getting paid. Construction froze. Cranes stopped mid-air, like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence no one wanted to finish. And suddenly, Mr. Lee understood something terrifying. The apartment he'd paid for might never exist. In 2022, desperation turned into defiance. Across China, homebuyers did something the state fears more than protests. They coordinated. The mortgage boycott spread across provinces. Thousands of families announced they would stop paying mortgages on unfinished homes. If you don't build, they said, we don't pay. In a surveillance state where dissent is crushed quickly, this was unprecedented. Videos surfaced of families moving into skeletal high-rises. No windows, no water. No electricity. Cooking on camping stoves. Sleeping beneath mosquito nets and exposed concrete shells. One young couple climbed 20 flights of stairs every night because the elevators were never installed. They filmed themselves unpacking groceries in a room open to the elements. Their message was simple. This was supposed to be our future. Meanwhile, the money had gone elsewhere. Into football clubs. Into speculative electric vehicle startups. Into interest payments on older debts. And yes, into the private fortunes of executives who believed the system would never end. The pre-sale model didn't just fail financially, it broke trust. It shattered the belief that hard work, savings, and obedience would be rewarded with stability. And once that belief cracks, it doesn't repair easily. This wasn't just a housing crash. It was a betrayal. And its consequences were only beginning to surface. If debt was the spark, demographics are the dry timber. Because real estate, its core is a game of replacement. You buy a home believing someone else will one day want it more than you did. That belief only works if there are more buyers tomorrow than today. In China, that assumption is collapsing. To understand why, we have to rewind again, this time to 1980. That was the year China introduced the one-child policy, one of the most ambitious social experiments in human history. The goal was simple: slow population growth to accelerate development. And on paper, it worked. Too well. Over 4 decades, China prevented an estimated 400 million births. 400 million people who were never born. 400 million future workers, consumers, renters, and first-time homebuyers who simply do not exist. Fast forward to the early 2020s. China's population began shrinking in 2022 and continued shrinking in 2023. The first sustained decline since the Great Famine of the 1960s. This wasn't a blip. It was the start of a long descent. The United Nations projects that China's population could nearly halve by the end of the century. Now imagine you're a property investor, sitting on an asset whose value depends entirely on future demand, but the future customer base is disappearing. You're trying to sell baby strollers in a retirement village. The math doesn't lie. For years, the housing boom was fueled by something known as the 4-to-1 family structure. For grandparents, it's 2 parents, 1 child. 6 adults pooling their savings to buy a single apartment for the little emperor. It was powerful. It concentrated wealth. It pushed prices higher and higher. But demographics don't move in one direction forever. Now flip the structure. That one child grows up. The grandparents pass away. The parents pass away. Suddenly, the child inherits multiple apartments, one from each set of grandparents, one from each set of grandparents. One person, 3 homes. Who do they sell to? Their peers who inherited 3 homes too. This is the nightmare scenario for real estate. Oversupply colliding with depopulation. And it gets worse. Youth unemployment surged past 20% in 2023 before the government quietly stopped publishing the data altogether. When a government stops releasing numbers, it's not because the problem was solved. It's because the answer became politically dangerous. Young people saw the writing on the wall. A movement called Tang Ping, or lying flat, spread across Chinese social media. Millions opted out. No marriage, no children, no 30-year mortgages for overpriced concrete boxes. Marriage statistics tell the story clearly. In 2013, China recorded 13.5 million marriages. By 2022, that number collapsed to 6.8 million, a 50% crash in household formation. No new households means no new demand. No demand means falling prices. And falling prices destroy the single greatest store of wealth Chinese families have ever known. Housing wasn't just shelter. It was the retirement plan. As that belief dies, so does consumer confidence. People stop spending. Businesses stop investing. The economy slows not because of policy, but because hope evaporates. And while this demographic wave rolls in slowly, it is unstoppable. You can cut interest rates, you can subsidize purchases, you can ban short selling, but you cannot print babies. The housing market was built on the assumption of endless people. The future arrived, and it's empty. And now the concrete is beginning to crack. At this point, you might be thinking, even if the homes are empty and prices fall, at least the buildings themselves have value. Concrete is concrete, right? Not in China. Because the next layer of this collapse isn't financial, it's physical. There's a phrase in China that terrifies homeowners more than foreclosure. Tofu dreg projects. The term was popularized in the late 1990s. After catastrophic floods revealed infrastructure that dissolved like wet paper, tofu dregs, the crumbly leftovers from making tofu, became the metaphor for construction so cheap, so rushed, and so corrupt that it barely qualifies as solid matter. And China built millions of homes this way. The logic was brutal, but rational. Developers weren't building for longevity. They were building for speed. Local officials weren't inspecting for safety. They were inspecting for completion dates. Everyone expected to be gone long before the consequences arrived. The result is footage that looks fake till you realize it isn't. Concrete pillars that crumble when tapped with a stick. Apartment walls filled with styrofoam instead of insulation. Balconies shearing off high-rises because the steel reinforcement was thinner than regulations required. One viral video shows a homeowner scraping the concrete off her ceiling with bare hands, revealing rusted rebar underneath. She wasn't renovating. She was touching her ceiling. This isn't incompetence. It's corruption. Inspectors bribed. Substandard materials approved. Sea sand full of corrosive salt instead of river sand because it was cheaper and faster. Salt eats steel from the inside. That means many of these buildings have an expiration date. In Western cities, a building constructed in 1920 is often more valuable today because it was built to last. In many Chinese cities, high-rises built in 2015 may be structurally unsafe by 2040. So what does that make them? Not assets, liabilities. Mr. Li didn't just buy a home that might never be finished. Even if it is completed, it could literally degrade faster than his mortgage does. And this isn't isolated. China is littered with the remains of growth projects built solely to hit targets. Entire fields of unused electric vehicles produced to claim subsidies, rusting in the sun. Mountains of shared bicycles discarded once the metrics were logged. The housing sector is simply the largest version of the same lie. It was built to say it was built, not to endure. When you combine 65 million empty units with construction that may not survive a generation, you don't have a housing market. You have a landfill with a skyline. And now, the consequences of that reality are spilling beyond China's borders. At this point, it's tempting to dismiss this as a distant tragedy, a uniquely Chinese problem, a cautionary tale confined to provinces you'll never visit. But this is the moment in the horror movie when the camera pulls back. You realize the danger already left the house. Because when the second largest economy on Earth collapses inward, it doesn't do so quietly. It sends shockwaves. Let's talk about how this reaches you, whether you live in Ohio, Manchester, Toronto, or Sydney. Vector 1. The commodity crash for 2 decades. China was the gravitational center of global commodities. It absorbed roughly half of the world's steel, massive portions of copper, cement, iron ore, lumber, and energy. Entire national economies were built around feeding China's construction machine. Australia dug, Brazil shipped, Africa borrowed, Canada extracted. When China stops building, demand doesn't slow, falls off a cliff. Iron ore prices collapse. Mining revenues evaporate. Infrastructure loans tied to China's Belt and Road Initiative dry up. Emerging markets feel it first. Then the pain migrates into pension funds, sovereign debt, and eventually Western equity markets. A Chinese ghost city means fewer jobs in places that never built one. Vector 2. The real estate reversal. Remember the global housing boom. Vancouver, London, Sydney, San Francisco. A significant portion of that demand came from Chinese wealth fleeing domestic risk. Property abroad became a safety deposit box with a view. Now the direction has reversed. Liquidity is vanishing. Developers are desperate. Capital is being pulled back or sold off. Luxury apartments hit the market at discounts. projects are halted mid-construction. Chinese-backed developments in Los Angeles and London quietly disappear. When forced sellers arrive, bubbles deflate. If you own a home, part of its value is indirectly connected to someone thousands of miles away trying to plug a hole in Shanghai. Vector 3. Deflation export. This one is counterintuitive, dangerous. As Chinese households feel poorer, consumption collapses. Factories still need to run. So China floods the world with cheap goods, electric vehicles, solar panels, electronics, at prices that domestic manufacturers in Europe, North America, and Mexico can't compete with. The result? Tariffs, trade wars, political tension. We're already seeing it 100% tariffs slapped on Chinese EVs, protectionism resurging, supply chains fragmenting. This isn't trade friction, it's economic fallout from a housing collapse. China doesn't sneeze anymore, it convulses. Now put yourself in Beijing. You are the leadership. You see the numbers, you know the scale, and you understand something terrifying. There is no painless exit. Option 1. Let the market clear. Developers fail, prices collapse, savings evaporate. Banks wobble, social unrest surges. That path risks chaos. Option 2. Bail everyone out, print money, absorb debt, socialize losses. That path risks currency debasement, moral hazard, and decades of stagnation. A Japanese-style lost era, but with a population far less wealthy. Neither option is acceptable. So China chooses a third path, controlled demolition. Finish homes, not companies. Save buyers, not billionaires. Banks are told to fund near-complete projects, just enough to stop riots. Developers are quietly sacrificed. Courts issue liquidation orders that mainland systems selectively ignore. AI Evergrande falls, Country Garden follows. Others line up. Meanwhile, Beijing pivots hard. From property to new productive forces, AI, chips, robotics, electric vehicles. But here's the brutal math. Real estate was nearly 30% of China's GDP. High-tech manufacturing might reach half of that eventually. You don't replace a concrete mountain with a handful of silicon wafers overnight. The transition will be slow, painful, politically dangerous, and worst of all, for the state, confidence is gone. You can print money, you can mandate lending, but you cannot print trust. Once belief breaks, systems decay quietly from within. It's easy to watch this story and feel superior, to point at China's central planning and say, that could never happen here. That's the wrong lesson. The warning isn't about ideology, it's about human psychology. The belief that housing only goes up, that leverage is safe, that tomorrow's buyer will always pay more. Sound familiar? In 2008, the United States built homes people couldn't afford. In the 2020s, China built homes people don't need and people who don't exist. Different systems, same flaw. This is malinvestment capital flowing where it shouldn't because cheap money distorts reality. You can't financialize shelter forever. You can't build prosperity by selling houses to yourself. Eventually, supply meets demand, and gravity wins. China's ghost cities are not anomalies. They're monuments to hubris, to incentives ignored, to math denied. We are watching the end of the largest construction boom in human history. A boom that lifted millions out of poverty and trapped millions more in debt, silence, and unfinished dreams. The ghost cities are not just empty buildings. They are warnings. Markets can remain irrational longer than individuals can remain solvent, but not forever. For Mr. Li, the dream is gone. For China, the reckoning is just beginning. And for the rest of the world, we should be paying attention. Because when the dust settles, we may discover our own foundations weren't as solid as we believed. Don't buy unfinished bridges. See you in the next one.